It's a stormy, chaotic morning, and high above the clouds on North America's tallest peak, where the air's thin and mercy's even thinner, 6 young climbers had just crawled out of a night from hell. They'd been trapped since the evening before, curled up in whatever shelter they could scrape together, bodies bruised, spirits cracked, teeth chattering from cold and fear, caught in a storm so vicious it felt like the mountain itself was trying to rip them apart. That night, under the Arctic sun, with the suffocating, blinding whiteout and hurricane-force winds, was anything but a relief. But then morning came. The wind seemed to calm a little. A lighter breeze made it seem like maybe the worst was behind them. Maybe the summit they'd been chasing for weeks was finally within reach, just a few hours away. But what's even closer is the cold grip of their fate. The climbers would finally make it to the top, only to realize there's nothing good waiting for them, because in just a few hours, the deadliest storm the mountain had seen in 100 years would drop down on them, unleashed in its full brutal power. The young climbers, their hard-won victory, their desperate fight for survival, and above all, the fragile hopes of those waiting for their return, would be consumed by a single, violent gust of wind. Worse, the very teammates who were supposed to have their backs would end up blaming them for their own deaths. This is their story. At the onset of Alaska's 1976 summer, several mountaineers across the United States started receiving something rather peculiar in their mailboxes. It was a newsletter, but not just any newsletter. It was an invitation wrapped in meticulous detail. Tucked inside were pages of logistics, a full itinerary, a neatly written travel guide, avalanche safety protocols laid out like a textbook, and at the center of it all, an open invitation to summit North America's tallest and most unforgiving peak, Denali. Still known back then as Mount McKinley, the man behind the ambitious outreach was a 24-year-old student from Brigham Young University, Joseph F. Wilcox, or Joe, as he liked to call himself. Joe had been on mountains particularly since a very young age, and was now setting his sights on his most ambitious climb yet, and his very first time leading an expedition of his own. For those who got the invite, though, it didn't feel so much exciting as it did weird. According to the itinerary, the entire expedition from Seattle to Alaska and all the way up the mountain would cost just $300 per person. That included food, travel, and transportation. Even by 1967 standards, the number was shockingly low. Adjusted for today, it'd be around $2,500. Still, dirt cheap for a shot at Denali's summit. To make those numbers work, Joe laid out a route that was practically the opposite of the standard southwestern approach commonly used today. His plan was to start from the north side of the mountain, crossing the infamous Muldrow Glacier first, and then pushing upward through a narrow stretch of rock and ice called Karstens Ridge, eventually reaching the upper slopes of the mountain. Had they taken the southwest route, they'd have been flown in and dropped off on the Kahiltna Glacier, kicking off the climb almost immediately with a steady march to establish the camps. But the northern route demanded a brutal 3-day slog through thick tundra, cutting across remote terrain just to reach the first campsite. But of course, without the cost of air support, the bargain price made sense. Over the next few weeks, Joe's somewhat out-of-the-box invitation ended up grabbing the attention of several recipients. Given his bold claim and a whole lot of over-the-top adventure, Joe managed to onboard a total of 8 climbers who were remarkably similar to him. Most of them were enthusiastic young adults in their 20s, with experience on local peaks, but none had the potential experience to climb a mountain over 4,500 meters. So it turned out to be a group of amateurs, fueled by a shared love for adventure, led by a man just as wild as they were, setting off on a nearly unknown, unconventional route against North America's tallest peak, which in fact is the deadliest of all 7 summits, even more so than Everest itself. For those unfamiliar, the term 7 summits refers to the highest peak on each of the 7 continents, like Mount Aconcagua in South America, Denali in North America, Kilimanjaro in Africa, Vinson in Antarctica, Elbrus in Europe, and Karstens Pyramid in Oceania or the Australian region. Everest in this setting reaches the highest altitude in Asia, as well as the highest on Earth. Down that road, K2 becomes the second tallest mountain, followed by other towering peaks and so on. In this ranking, Denali doesn't even make it into the top 100 highest peaks in the world, elevation-wise. But elevation alone can't always paint the full picture. Basically, geologists usually measure a mountain's height by how far it stands above sea level. So Everest clocks in at 8,850 meters above sea level, while Denali reaches just 6,190 meters. On paper, Everest clearly wins. But that number doesn't always tell you how tall the mountain actually is. Sometimes a peak sits on a massive plateau that already starts thousands of meters above sea level, inflating the final number. In Everest's case, the base camp, the point where most treks actually begin, is already perched at 5,364 meters. That means the vertical rise of the mountain itself from base to summit is only about 3,486 meters. Denali, on the other hand, sits on much lower ground. Its base is around 600 meters above sea level, which means the actual climb spans over 5,500 vertical meters, making it a significantly longer, tougher ascent than Everest, despite the lower elevation. And then there's the weather. As North America's highest point, Denali is a magnet for violent weather shifts. Whiteout clouds, bone-cutting winds, and abrupt storms that can come out of nowhere. There's even a saying among visitors that if you actually see the mountain, you're part of the 30% club, because 70% of the time, it's hidden behind thick clouds. That's just for sightseeing. Step in closer, try climbing it, and suddenly the numbers stop being just numbers. Between 1947 and 2018, there were 2,799 reported mountaineering accidents in the US, and Denali alone accounted for 11% of them. Out of all of the accidents, 43% ended in death, and 8% of those deaths happened on Denali. On top of that, the success rate of summiting the mountain is roughly 30% lower than Everest. Apart from the elevation gain or the brutal weather, one of the biggest challenges comes from the mountain's extreme geographical isolation. Even along its standard routes, there's no quick backup or organized support. Climbers are mostly on their own from start to finish. There are no Sherpas to help carry supplies or give real-time instructions, the way you'd typically find on Himalayan climbs. Which means you carry your weight, literally and mentally. And of course, that becomes even more dangerous when someone takes a non-traditional route. And worse still, when the team doesn't even have the necessary experience to back it up. That's exactly where things started to unravel for Joe and his 8-member team. The first real hurdle came before they even set foot on the mountain. During registration with the National Park Service in Alaska, the officials questioned their lack of high-altitude experience and their unconventional plan. Eventually, they were told to join up with a separate team of 4 experienced mountaineers from Colorado before their expedition would be approved. This group was led by Howard Snyder, who planned to climb the mountain around the same time. When the suggestion came up to merge with another party, Howard and his team weren't too keen on that idea at first. They had set out with the goal of doing the climb on their own. But then, whether it was fate or plain bad timing, one of their 4 team members got into a traffic accident just before they were supposed to head to Alaska. This injury took him out of the climb completely. With their team now falling short of the Park Service's required 4-person minimum, Howard was left with no choice but to join Joe's expedition. Bringing in the remaining 9 from that side, the 2 groups formed a 12-person team that would now attempt to climb together. The Park Service approved their application, but with a few conditions. Each member had to purchase and carry a radio during the climb. The more experienced climbers from the Colorado group were required to stay with the less experienced members of Joe's team. Those without high altitude experience needed to undergo training to prepare for the extreme elevation. That made sense, because even though Denali doesn't have a death zone like the big Himalayan peaks that stretch beyond 8,000 meters, it doesn't make it any easier. In fact, Denali's upper altitudes have some of the thinnest breathable air you'll find on any mountain that size. The reason lies in its brutal northern location, way up near 63 degrees latitude. That kind of placement means the air pressure drops even lower than you'd expect from that height alone. After days of training, sorting logistics, checking gear, and wading through all the necessary paperwork, Joe and the now 12-man team finally set off toward the base of Denali in late June 1967. But right from the start, things weren't exactly off to a smooth beginning. The first challenge was the long, grueling 3-day trek they'd picked instead of flying, just to save money. That decision came back to bite them, because the tundra they had to cross was crawling with mosquitoes. It was miserable, and since they didn't have any porters, they had to drag all of their heavy gear themselves, on their backs and on sleds. Still, the whole crew somehow pushed through and reached Camp 1 at the top of McGonnell Pass right before hitting the Muldrow Glacier. The days that followed, though, were just as rough. They were constantly moving up and down the glacier, keeping an eye out for crevasses and ice falls, hauling all that heavy equipment from one camp to another. And it wasn't just about carrying stuff. They had to build each camp from scratch, dig through ice, set things up, and get everything in order without any outside help. But the worst part was the constant, gnawing fear of the glacier itself. That thing was no joke. By 1967, 4 climbers had already lost their lives on Denali, 3 of them right there on the Muldrow Glacier. Joe and his team knew exactly what kind of risk they were walking into. All that back-breaking labor and constant coordination slowly started eating away at the group's cohesion. The Colorado climbers were already on the fence about joining the expedition to begin with, so tensions were simmering under the surface. Joe had even taken the time to write down everyone's roles just to keep things organized and avoid fights later on. But when fatigue sets in and people are worn to the bone, nobody's looking at a rulebook. As the group shuffled their supplies between Camp 1 and Camp 2, 23-year-old John Russell from Joe's group started losing his cool. A few miscommunications about who was doing what set him off, and at one point he marched straight up to Joe and told him he was out. Joe talked him down, but by the end, John had earned the reputation of being the hothead in the group, something that wouldn't help the already tense atmosphere. Joe kept trying to keep things positive, hoping a little morale boost might help. He even mixed up the rope teams so everyone could work with different people, thinking it'd build some teamwork. But things just kept getting worse. Camp 2 was set up at a place called Lower Icefall, around 2,000 meters. The group had stashed some food supplies there, and now the discussion was about whether to cross the glacier from the right or the left side. As the argument raged on, all hell broke loose. A massive avalanche thundered down the left side of the icefall, and they only just barely managed to avoid being swept away with their supplies. The choice to go right became painfully obvious, but the terrifying close call only deepened the sense of panic and disarray within the group. Then, as they climbed up the icefall, one of the climbers fell into a massive crevasse. It was a close call, but they managed to pull him out. A few more grueling days passed, and the team finally made it up to 400 meters to set up Camp 3. They pushed on, and by July 4th, almost 2 weeks since they started, Camp 4 was up at 3,600 meters, right below the Harper Icefall, which was named after the glacier coming down from the higher reaches of the mountain. The icefall was so unstable and prone to massive avalanches that crossing it directly was out of the question, so the climbers had to take a detour through a nearby cliff walk known as Karstens Ridge. But this was no less dangerous. The ridge shot straight up, rising 1.2 kilometers high and stretching over 3 kilometers long. It was a narrow path with terrifying drop-offs on either side. Needless to say, even the toughest climbers couldn't get through it without feeling the weight of it. And that's exactly what started to happen. As the climb wore on, 30-year-old Anshel Schiff began developing chronic indigestion, making it tough for him to eat. Days went by, and his condition got worse. He became incredibly weak from carrying heavy loads while not getting enough nutrition. The team tried to get him to lighten his load, but he refused to let anyone else carry it. His struggles seemed to spread to the rest of the team, as everyone started experiencing some form of altitude sickness as they reached Camp 5 at 4,600 meters on July 13th. The climb ahead was going to be much tougher, and a lot more exciting than the little problems they dealt with so far. The group pushed everything else aside and decided to move forward, setting up what was supposed to be their final camp before they made their summit push. However, the same day, a radio message came in from park rangers, warning about a storm that might form around July 16th or 17th. The good news was that the weather was expected to stay clear until then. With that in mind, the team gathered to figure out their plan. Joe, leading the charge, suggested they make a quick run for the summit in the next 2 days, aiming to get back to base camp by the 15th, well ahead of the storm. Since the attempt would be rushed, they needed a bit more time to adjust to the altitude, so they decided to set up an extra intermediate camp just 400 meters higher to give themselves a night to acclimatize properly. And so Camp 6 was set up at 5,000 meters that same day, and the climbers would crash there for the night before making their way up to the summit the next day. The next morning, Joe split the 12-man team into 2 groups. 8 heading to Camp 7, and the remaining 4 stayed behind to follow them. Normally, splitting up like this is pretty standard. It's meant to make things easier, cut down on logistical hassles, and simplify decision-making since there are fewer people to coordinate. Plus, it gives everyone a better shot at summiting, since the smaller groups can move faster, giving the other team more time to catch up. It seemed like a reasonable plan. But with this particular group, that decision ended up being the most controversial move of the whole expedition. The problem was, none of the 4 climbers left behind had experience above 4,500 meters, which was a big deal. Joe himself was pretty much the same, but he took 4 of his team with him, plus the 3 Colorado climbers, who were the most experienced and supposed to stay with the less experienced ones. But somehow, the 8-man team didn't really think things through. They told the 4 climbers to rest for a day at Camp 6, and then bring up a fresh supply of gear the next day. That same morning, one of the stoves exploded, catching a tent on fire. Luckily, the climbers inside made it out with a few injuries, but it definitely set them back a bit. After sorting that mess out, they finally left for Camp 7 around 10 a.m. on July 14th, aiming to push for the summit from there. When they got to Camp 7 and settled in for the night, the group split again, this time into 2 teams of 4. Joe and the 3 Colorado climbers went ahead to make a push for the summit, leaving behind the 8 less experienced climbers, 4 of whom were still at Camp 6, hoping they'd catch up. To this day, no one really knows why this split happened the way it did, but some of the expedition's accounts suggested the 4 who stayed behind at Camp 7 didn't want to leave until their friends caught up from Camp 6. Another theory is that the more experienced climbers went ahead to set the trail so the rest of the group could follow their tracks, making the summit push a little easier. Plus, there was Anshel Schiff, the climber who'd been sick earlier. He was with the group that went ahead, but as they got higher, his condition worsened and he decided to stay behind. So that could have been the reason for the second split. Whatever the reason, around 2 p.m. on July 15th, after they'd been climbing for a while, Joe and his trio radioed back from Camp 7 to let everyone know the weather up top was clear. The temperature, though, below freezing, was still pretty manageable. They were pushing themselves hard, climbing over 150 meters vertically per hour. A little over 3.5 hours after their last radio check, they finally crossed the last ridge and set foot on the summit of North America's tallest peak. For Joe, this was huge. He was just a recent graduate, and here he was standing at the top of the continent after leading a chaotic expedition all the way up. The group took in the endless views, and they radioed their monumental achievement back to camp, lighting up those orange flares they'd carry with them to celebrate their success. About an hour and a half later, they started descending, and exactly 2 hours after that, they made it back to Camp 7 with the sun still shining brightly. Thanks to Denali's proximity to the North Pole, it was 24-hour daylight at that time of year, When they arrived back, the 4 climbers from Camp 6 had made it to Camp 7 as well, so all 12 climbers were now at the same camp. The next morning, on July 16th, the remaining 8 climbers would leave for the summit, while Joe and his group would begin their descent. But according to the storm forecast, it was around this time that the weather was supposed to turn. Until now, though, the skies had been as clear as could be. It looked like the next day would be just as nice, except they were 5,500 meters up on Denali, where weather patterns could change in the blink of an eye. And that's exactly what happened the very next morning. When the groups woke up, the gusts of wind were howling at 113 kilometers per hour, slamming their tents with bone-rattling force. Forget about the summit attempt. Standing outside their tents wasn't even an option. The 12 climbers huddled inside, chewing on whatever scraps of food they had left, waiting for the storm to blow over. Everyone was feeling it. Altitude sickness, nausea, the works. It felt like the air was thinner than ever, and on top of that, they had to shovel snow off their tents every few hours, just to keep from being buried. The optimism and confidence from the day before quickly shattered with the brutal weather. Hungry, sick, and weak, the climbers even started thinking maybe it wasn't worth it to continue their summit attempt at all. But there was nothing to do except sit tight and ride out the storm, whether they wanted to move ahead or turn back. The whole day dragged on like that. When the next morning came, there was a strange silence. No harsh winds or snow pounding against their tents. It looked like the weather might hold up for at least a few hours. And suddenly, the summit attempt seemed possible again. 7 of the 8 climbers decided to continue, while Anshel Schiff, who had been struggling for too long, chose to turn back. He joined Joe and his team to retreat to the lower camps, while the remaining 7 climbers set their sights on the summit. By 1 p.m., Joe's group left their camp, but as they descended, they noticed movement at the camp until around 2 p.m., which meant the summit party hadn't left immediately, and considering their lack of experience, it wasn't exactly a great idea to start the summit attempt that late, especially with the weather being so unpredictable. While Joe and his team speculated about what could be going on, things up above were getting messy. The climbing party had now dropped from 7 to 6 members. Another climber had started feeling the effects of altitude sickness and chose to stay behind at Camp 7. The rest of them finally set off for the summit after 2 p.m., making good progress up the upper slopes until around 8 p.m. That's when the weather suddenly flipped. Clear skies turned into a full-blown storm, and it stopped them dead in their tracks. The group lost all sense of where they were. A few minutes later, they radioed the park ranger station to let them know they were stuck somewhere on the upper slopes, but they had no idea exactly where because the whiteout was so intense. They also mentioned they were planning to sleep directly on the ice that night in makeshift shelters and continue their trek in the morning. This is called bivouacking, and it's a pretty crucial skill for mountaineers when you're stuck in a situation where turning back or pushing forward just isn't an option. About 15 hours after that call, the ranger station got another radio message from the climbers. This time, they said they had made it to the summit, but on the way up, they lost track of the hothead John Russell in the whiteout. The weather was still awful, and they assumed he'd been left behind in the storm, probably turning back and aborting his summit attempt. They hoped they'd run into him on the way down. Little did they know, they would never. When the park rangers passed this bittersweet news to Joe and his team, the 5 climbers were left anxiously waiting for another update from the summit party. They'd also mentioned they weren't planning to stay on the summit for more than 5 or 10 minutes and would start descending right after, with radio checks set for 8 p.m. that same evening. But hours went by, and neither the park rangers nor Joe's group heard anything. No radio call, no updates, no sign of the climbers. The last radio message would end up being the final time anyone ever heard from them. Just a few minutes after the radio call ended, the weather took a turn from bad to borderline apocalyptic. A violent clash between low and high pressure winds detonated a thunderstorm right over the mountain summit. Not near it, not around it, right on top, dead center. For over a week, the storm sat there, unrelenting, like it had a score to settle. Later, it would be remembered as the deadliest to strike Alaska in 100 years. Some of the early weather reports mentioned wind speeds between 160 to 240 kilometers per hour. That alone would be enough to make the air feel like it had knives. But when the National Weather Service released their full breakdown, it had told a much darker story. Those winds had reached at least 480 kilometers per hour. On flat terrain, that kind of force would level homes like matchsticks and tear buildings right off their foundations. But this wasn't flat land. This was North America's tallest peak. Severe avalanches, sheets of black ice ripping loose, hurricane-force gusts slamming into jagged cliffs and sending down a rain of lethal rocks. Every second would have brought a fresh disaster. And then there was the cold. Not just sub-zero, not just freezing. This would have been the kind of cold that seeps into your core and starts shutting your body down from the inside out. For any climbers caught out there, it wouldn't have been a matter of if, it would have been how fast. Some would have been flash frozen where they stood. Others would have been torn from the face of the mountain, ripped away by the wind like scraps of cloth. No shelter, no warning, no chance. Survival wasn't even on the table. Back at the lower camps, the remaining group had no idea what was really going on up there. They figured the storm would ease up soon, and any moment now, they'd hear back from the summit team. But 2 days passed, and there was still no word. That's when Joe and his team, who had managed to descend to around 4,500 meters, decided they couldn't just sit and wait. On the morning of July 20th, Joe and 2 other climbers set out to climb back toward Camp 7, risking the same storm that had already swallowed their friends. But not even halfway up, the punishing conditions pushed them back. Once they returned, they officially sounded an emergency call to the park rangers. But it was no use. The storm had locked the mountain in a chokehold, and for the entire week, any attempt to search or rescue was out of the question. The weather simply wouldn't allow it. By the time the wind died down on July 23rd, Joe's team was falling apart. 2 of his men were barely upright, starved, soaked, and slipping in and out of lucidity. Even Joe and Howard, who had kept the group going, began to lose feeling in their limbs. The cold was crawling in, and he knew they couldn't risk climbing back up, not with their own lives hanging by a thread. So leaving the matter to the rangers, the group of 5 had no choice but to descend. On their way down, they crossed paths with another climbing party from the Mountaineering Club of Alaska, or the MCA. The MCA team offered some much-needed food, dry clothes, and a moment of relief. One of them even volunteered to descend with Joe's team, while the rest pressed on into the storm-ravaged heights, chasing a faint, fading hope of finding the missing climbers. By July 28th, the MCA climbers had made it to the upper slopes, and what they found wasn't a campsite. It was a graveyard. Camp 7 had been obliterated, ripped to pieces like it had never existed. Amid this wreckage, they came across a body with arms still wrapped around a tent pole, frozen to death in the same position. The body looked like it had frozen and thawed several times over the past 10 days. It was extremely decomposed. There was no way to tell who it was. Some guessed it might have been the impulsive young climber John Russell, or maybe Steve Taylor, who had fallen ill at the last minute and stayed behind to wait for the summit party. The next day, the search team climbed further and found 2 more bodies. They too were frozen in a seated, upright posture, almost as if bracing themselves against the wind, hoping to endure just one more blast. Those 2 were unidentifiable, but it was believed they were Dennis Luchterhand and Walt Taylor, who were the strongest men in the missing group. The MCA team wasn't able to bring any of the 3 bodies down. At that time, there was no specialized equipment for high-altitude recovery, and the risk was simply too great. As for the other climbers, no trace of them was ever found. A year later, a humanitarian expedition returned to Denali with hopes of locating and laying all 7 mountaineers to rest. But by then, even the 3 bodies found earlier had disappeared, likely swept away by the wind or buried under layers of snow. In the end, none of the 7 climbers were ever formally recovered. Joe Wilcox and his team eventually made it off the mountain in late July that year, but the shadow of what happened followed them for decades. Joe especially became the center of scrutiny. Critics slammed his leadership, said he lacked experience, made poor decisions, and led his team into a death trap. At first, Joe accepted some of the blame, but in 1973, the leader of the Colorado team, Howard Snyder, published his memoir, In the Hall of the Mountain King. In it, he tore into Joe's leadership, portraying him as reckless and incompetent, second-guessing every decision he made. The memoir was scathing, and experts would later call it biased and one-sided. This, however, prompted Joe to eventually tell his side in his own book, White Winds, published in 1981. In it, he shifted the blame to faulty communication with the Rangers. He said the radios they brought didn't work right and the team never got a clear storm warning in time. Officials claimed a forecast had been issued for July 16th and 17th, but Joe insisted nothing concrete ever reached them. Other survivors pointed fingers at the climbers who died. They claimed the group should have turned back the moment the weather changed, but instead they bivouacked, tried to wait out the night, and that choice likely sealed their fate. A common counter-criticism from experts on this point is that the stranded mountaineers simply didn't have the experience to gauge the full ferocity of Denali's storm. That's why the Colorado team was supposed to guide them. But when the group split up unevenly, the less experienced were left to fend for themselves. This again brings the blame back to Joe Wilcox, who was supposed to divide the group evenly and keep everyone together. And just like that, the accusations continue to fly. One person blaming the next, each voice getting louder and more bitter. But when you peel back all of the noise and look at the facts, it all comes down to a chilling report from the National Weather Service and the National Oceanic and Atmosphere Administration. Their investigation revealed that the storm, which suddenly exploded on the upper slopes of Denali that week, was completely unavoidable and utterly unsurvivable. No person, no matter how expert or prepared, had any chance in those conditions. And the idea that the climbers could have somehow sensed the storm coming, that's just wishful thinking as well. Even today, forecasters struggle to predict the rapid changes in weather on the mountain. And this was back in the 60s, when they had no proper technology or a way of knowing what was coming. The Wilcox expedition would go down in history as the worst mountaineering disaster the US had ever seen, and one of the deadliest in the world. And as the saying goes, you don't summit a mountain, it lets you. It's fair to say that Denali, on that day, had no intention of letting that summit happen.